He was the richest man in Detroit, a CEO building a legacy of steel and glass meant to revive a city's heart. But the heart was rejecting the transplant. His billion-dollar project was failing, met with the cold silence of a community that saw it as a monument to a man they didn't trust. He was losing. Then, at a tense public meeting, when his best-paid architects had no answers, a voice rose from the back of the room. A voice that belonged to a homeless man in a tattered coat, a man who saw the fatal flaw in the design that no one else could. The air in the community hall was thick with resentment. Samuel Kingston, CEO of Kingston Properties, stood at the podium, a portrait of impotent power. At 45, he had a reputation for turning forgotten city blocks into profitable empires. His suits were sharp, his handshake firm, and his donations to the city were legendary. But the Phoenix Project, his legacy, a sprawling mixed-use development meant to breathe life back into the historic Black Bottom neighborhood, was dying on the vine. The architectural models gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, showcasing sleek, sterile towers and perfectly manicured, empty plazas. It was a masterpiece of modern design, and the community hated it. An elderly woman with eyes that had seen the neighborhood's entire history stood up, her voice trembling with anger. "You call this a revival, Mr. Kingston? You've given us a fortress. There's no soul here. You didn't ask what we needed. You just built what you wanted." Samuel had no answer. His lead architect, a slick, ambitious man named Marcus Thorne, tried to placate the crowd with jargon about synergistic urban flow and optimized public spaces. But the words were hollow. The project was a failure of the heart, and everyone in the room knew it. It was then that the voice came from the back. It was quiet, but it cut through the noise with the clarity of a bell. "The sightlines are wrong." Every head turned. Standing near the exit was a man who clearly didn't belong. He was in his late 30s, with a worn, haunted look in his eyes. His coat was thin and frayed, his beard untrimmed, and he clutched a battered leather tube as if it were his only possession. He was one of the city's ghosts, a man made invisible by poverty. Marcus sneered. "Excuse me, do you have a degree in architecture?" The man ignored him, his gaze fixed on the model. "You've designed a river with no banks. People won't flow through it, they'll rush to escape it. There's no center, no gathering place. You've built a monument for people to look at, not a home for them to live in. Your Grand Plaza is a wind tunnel, and your retail spaces are cut off from foot traffic. It's beautiful, but it's dead." He stepped forward, pulled a used napkin from his pocket and a small, worn pencil. With a few swift, impossibly elegant strokes, he sketched. He broke up the sterile plaza, adding a central circular amphitheater. He curved the walkways, creating intimate nooks and gardens. He reoriented the main tower to shield the public spaces from the wind. In 30 seconds, on a stained napkin, he had given the project what a team of $100,000 architects had failed to find in a year: a soul. He slid the napkin onto the edge of the stage. "That's where the heart should be," he said quietly. And then, as if embarrassed by the attention, he turned to leave. Samuel Kingston stared at the sketch, his mind reeling. The simple, brilliant design solved the dozen problems at once. It was genius, pure, unadulterated genius. "Wait!" he called out, his voice booming through the now silent hall. The man paused at the door, his back still to the room. "Who are you?" The man hesitated for a long moment. "Nobody," he said, and then he was gone. disappearing into the cold Detroit night. But Samuel held the napkin in his hand. It wasn't the work of a nobody. It was the work of a master. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that his legacy depended on finding the homeless man who had just saved it. For 2 days, Samuel's security team scoured the city. They had only a grainy image from the community hall CCTV and a name given by a shelter worker who recognized the description: David. Just David. He was a ghost who slept under bridges and in abandoned buildings, known for his quiet dignity and for the strange, intricate drawings he would sometimes sketch in the dirt with a stick. Samuel found him on the 3rd day, huddled under the skeletal remains of the old Packard plant, sketching the patterns of rust on a steel beam. The leather tube was resting beside him. Samuel approached slowly, not as a CEO, but as a man seeking an audience with a master. "David?" he said, his voice soft. The man looked up, his eyes holding the same weary intelligence as before. He didn't seem surprised. He simply nodded. "Your sketch, it's brilliant," Samuel said, sitting on a crumbling concrete block nearby. "My team has been working on it. It solves everything. I want to hire you. I want you to lead the redesign." David gave a hollow laugh, the sound echoing in the vast, empty space. "I can't." "Why not? I'll pay you whatever you want. I'll give you a place to live, a studio, anything." "You don't understand," David said, his gaze dropping to the ground. "You can't hire a ghost." He opened the leather tube and carefully unrolled a set of old, yellowed blueprints. They were breathtaking. It was a design for a community arts center, a building that seemed to dance, all curves and light and open spaces. At the bottom, a title block read, "The Harmon Center. Lead Architect, David Chenault." The name hit Samuel like a lightning bolt. David Chenault, the oracle of urban design, a prodigy who had redesigned half of Chicago's public spaces before he was 30, a genius who had vanished a decade ago. "I remember this," Samuel whispered, his voice filled with awe. "This was supposed to be your masterpiece. What happened?" David's face hardened, the memories a visible weight on his shoulders. "I designed it. I poured my soul into it. But the contractor, a man named Silas Croft, cut corners. He used substandard steel to save money. I warned him. I begged him. He paid off the inspectors and pushed the project through." He paused, his voice cracking. "During the grand opening, a support beam failed. The West Wing collapsed. 17 people died. My wife and my 7-year-old daughter were inside. They were there to surprise me." Samuel felt the air leave his lungs. He had no words. "Silas blamed me," David continued, his voice hollow. "He produced falsified documents showing I'd approved the cheaper materials. The media called me a murderer. I lost my license, my reputation, my will to live. After the trial where Silas walked free, I just walked away. I couldn't build anymore. Everything I touched felt like it was turning to dust." He looked up at Samuel, his eyes shimmering with a decade of unshed tears. "So you see, Mr. Kingston, I'm not the man you want. The last thing I built killed my family. I can't do it again." Samuel was silent for a long time, the weight of the man's tragedy filling the space between them. He had come looking for an architect. He had found a shattered soul. He saw the brilliant mind, the profound grief, and the quiet, unbreakable honor of a man who had taken the blame for another's sin. "This is different," Samuel said, his voice thick with conviction he hadn't felt in years. "This is not about building a structure. It's about rebuilding a life, your life, and the lives of the people in this neighborhood. Silas Croft built that tragedy. You didn't. Don't let him take your gift from you, too." He stood up, his decision made. "I'm not asking you to be the oracle of urban design. I'm asking you to be David. Work with me. Let's build something that honors them. Let's build something with a soul. He held out his hand. It wasn't a command from a CEO. It was a plea from one man to another. David stared at the outstretched hand, then at his, calloused and dirty. For a decade, he had believed he was poisoned. But in Samuel's eyes, he saw not a ghost, but a genius in exile. With a trembling breath, he took Samuel's hand. The grip was firm. It felt like an anchor in a storm that had raged for 10 years.
The transformation of David Chenault was a quiet resurrection. Samuel didn't parade him in front of the board or the press. He gave him a simple, clean apartment near the project site and a small private office in a quiet corner of the Kingston Properties headquarters. It was a room with a large drafting table, good light, and a door that locked. For David, it was a sanctuary. For the first week, he just sat in the office, the smell of fresh paper and drafting pencils a long-forgotten comfort. He was afraid to draw, afraid the ghosts of his past would guide his hand. But Samuel was patient. He would bring him coffee in the morning, and they would just talk. Not about deadlines, but about the neighborhood, about the people David had started quietly observing. He worked closely with Imani, the project's passionate community liaison. She had been one of the most vocal critics at the public meeting, but when she saw David's napkin sketch, she had been the first to see its potential. She became his guide, introducing him to the shop owners, the church pastors, and the kids who played basketball on the cracked courts. She saw the deep well of sadness in him, but also the brilliant light of his vision. They need a place to feel safe, she told him one afternoon as they walked through the neighborhood. A place that feels like it belongs to them, not to a corporation. That was the key. David threw out Marcus Thorne's sterile, top-down designs. He started from scratch, with the community's soul as his foundation. He designed a marketplace for local vendors, a daycare with a rooftop garden, and a small performance stage in the central amphitheater. He used reclaimed brick from demolished buildings in the neighborhood, weaving the area's history into its future. The Phoenix Project was no longer a monument to Samuel Kingston. It was becoming a reflection of the people it was meant to serve. Back at the office, Marcus Thorne watched with growing fury. He had been the golden boy, the architect of the company's most ambitious project. Now he was being sidelined for a homeless man. David's success was a direct indictment of his own failure, and his pride could not endure it. "It's a liability, Samuel," Marcus argued in a tense meeting. "His name is toxic. When the press finds out who he is, they'll crucify us. They'll bring up the Harmon Center collapse all over again." "I'm aware of the risks," Samuel said calmly, his faith in David unshaken. "But I've seen his new designs. They're not just good, Marcus, they're transcendent." Marcus began a campaign of subtle sabotage. Blueprints would go missing from David's office. Meetings with city planners would be mysteriously rescheduled without his knowledge. He would whisper doubts to board members, framing David's human-centric designs as fiscally irresponsible and a deviation from the core profit mission. David fell to the resistance, the invisible friction, but he was too consumed by his work to give it much thought. He was coming back to life. The haunted look in his eyes was being replaced by the focused, intense gaze of an artist at work. He and Imani spent long nights in the office, their conversations blending from architectural specifications to personal hopes and dreams. A quiet, deep affection grew between them, a bond forged in shared purpose. One evening, as they were working late, Imani touched his arm gently. "You're not a ghost anymore, David." He looked at her, at the warmth and belief in her eyes, and for the first time in 10 years, he felt it too. But Marcus was not going to let this quiet rebirth continue. If sabotage wouldn't work, he would have to resort to something more direct. He needed to remind the world and himself of the ghost he used to be. He made a phone call, Silas, it's Marcus Thorne. We haven't spoken in a while, but I have a business proposition for you. It involves our mutual acquaintance, David Chenault, and a very lucrative contract for your construction firm.
The press conference was set to be a turning point. After months of redesign and community consultation, Samuel was ready to unveil the new vision for the Phoenix Project. The event was held on site, with the skeletal framework of the first new buildings rising behind the stage. The mood was electric. The community, once hostile, was now cautiously optimistic. Imani moved through the crowd, a bridge of smiles and handshakes. David stood nervously to the side of the stage. This would be his first public appearance as an architect in a decade. He wore a simple, well-fitted suit Samuel had insisted on buying for him. He looked like a different man, his shoulders straight, his gaze clear. Imani gave his hand a reassuring squeeze. "You're ready for this." Samuel took the stage to a round of applause. He spoke not of profit margins, but of partnership. He praised the community for their passion, and then he introduced the man who had translated that passion into a design. "It is my profound honor to introduce the lead architect for the new Phoenix Project, Mr. David Chenault." A ripple of shock and recognition went through the older members of the press. The David Chenault, the disgraced architect from the Harmon Center tragedy? Before David could even step forward, another man pushed his way to the front of the crowd, a microphone in his hand. It was Silas Croft, his face a mask of practiced outrage. "You're putting this man in charge?" Silas boomed, his voice amplified by the news cameras that immediately swiveled towards him. "This is an insult to this city. This is the man whose shoddy designs killed 17 people, including his own family. Are you going to let him build another death trap in the heart of your neighborhood?" The crowd erupted in chaos. Shouts of anger and confusion filled the air. David froze, the color draining from his face. The ghosts he had worked so hard to banish came rushing back, their whispers turning into a roar in his mind. He saw the collapsing building, heard the screams, saw his wife's face. He stumbled back, his breath catching in his chest. Marcus Thorne stood at the back of the crowd, a thin, triumphant smile on his lips. It was working perfectly. He had arranged for Silas to be here, had fed him the talking points. He was destroying David with the one weapon he couldn't fight, his own past. Imani rushed to David's side, trying to shield him. "Don't listen to him, David. It's a lie." But David barely heard her. The shame, the grief, the crushing weight of it all came crashing down on him. He turned and fled, pushing his way through the stunned crowd, away from the cameras, away from the accusations, away from the life he had just started to rebuild. Samuel stood on the stage, his face a thundercloud of fury. He saw Marcus's smug expression and understood instantly what had just happened. This was a coup, an act of public execution. He grabbed the microphone. "This press conference is over," he declared, his voice cutting through the noise. But the damage was done. The headlines that night would not be about a community revival. They would be about a disgraced architect's return and a project now mired in scandal. David ran until the city lights blurred into a watercolor of pain. He didn't go back to his apartment. He went to the only place that felt honest. The underpass by the river, the place where he had been a ghost. He sat on the cold ground, the leather tube of his old life in his hands, and for the first time in 10 years, he let himself sob, a broken, ragged sound of a man who had lost everything all over again. The fallout was immediate and brutal. The Phoenix Project was put on hold. Investors panicked. The city council launched an inquiry.
The media had a field day, reprinting old articles about the Harmon Center collapse, painting David as a tragic, dangerous figure, and Samuel as a reckless CEO who had gambled with the city's safety. Samuel didn't care about the investors or the media. He cared about finding David. For 2 days he searched, calling shelters, walking the cold streets. He finally found him back at the Packard plant, sitting in the same spot where they had first truly talked. David looked smaller, his face hollowed out by grief, the spark in his eyes extinguished. "They were right," David whispered as Samuel approached. "I bring ruin. Everything I touch, it breaks." "No," Samuel said, his voice fierce. He sat beside him, not on a crumbling block this time, but on the cold, hard ground. "One man's lie doesn't erase your truth, David. Marcus did this. He brought Silas there to destroy you because he was threatened by your talent. It doesn't matter. The story is told. No one will ever trust me again." "I trust you," Samuel said, his voice unwavering. "Imani trusts you. The people in that neighborhood who saw your designs, who talked with you, they trust you. We are not going to let him win." David looked at him, a flicker of the old fire returning to his eyes. "How? He has the world convinced I'm a monster." "We fight back with the truth," Samuel said. "I've had my legal team digging into Silas Croft's company for the past 48 hours. He's a corner cutter, always has been. There has to be a record, a witness, something we can use. And I put a tail on Marcus. The man is arrogant. He will make a mistake." The mistake came sooner than they expected. That evening, Samuel's private investigator sent him a photograph. It was of Marcus Thorne and Silas Croft meeting in a dimly lit bar, a thick envelope passing between them. It was the smoking gun. But Samuel knew it wasn't enough. They needed more than proof of a payoff. They needed to dismantle the original lie. Imani had an idea. "The families of the Harmon Center victims," she said, her voice soft but determined. "They were the ones who suffered the most. They believed the lie, too. If we can show them the truth, their voices will be louder than any headline." It was a painful, almost impossible task. They started with the foreman from the original construction, a man who had retired in shame. After hours of conversation, he finally broke down. He admitted that Silas had threatened his family to keep him quiet about the substandard materials. He had the original invoices hidden away for a decade. Armed with this, David and Imani began the heart-wrenching process of meeting with the victims' families. They faced anger, grief, and slammed doors. But David didn't defend himself. He just listened. He let them pour out a decade of pain. He showed them his original designs, the safety specifications Silas had ignored. He showed them the foreman's invoices. And slowly, one by one, hearts began to change. The final confrontation took place not in a courtroom, but in the Davenport Innovations boardroom. Samuel had called an emergency meeting. Marcus walked in, confident his coup was nearly complete. Silas Croft was there, at his invitation. "Gentlemen," Marcus began, "in light of the ongoing scandal, I believe it's time for a change in leadership." "I agree," Samuel interrupted, his voice like steel. The doors to the boardroom opened. In walked David, Imani, and behind them a dozen people, the families of the victims of the Harmon Center collapse. Silas Croft's face went white. Marcus stared, his composure finally cracking. "What is the meaning of this?" he stammered. "This is the truth," David said, his voice steady and clear. He laid the foreman's invoices on the polished boardroom table. He played a recording of the foreman's confession. And then, one by one, the family members spoke, their voices raw with grief, but united in a new, terrible understanding of who the real villain was. When they were finished, Samuel projected the photograph of Marcus and Silas onto the main screen. The image of the envelope passing between them was undeniable. "You are finished, Marcus," Samuel said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Both of you." Security escorted a pale, trembling Marcus and a sputtering Silas from the room. The lie that had stood for 10 years had been shattered in 10 minutes. In the silent boardroom, David stood surrounded by the people who had once cursed his name. One of them, an elderly man whose son had died in the collapse, stepped forward and placed a hand on David's shoulder. "We're sorry, son. We didn't know." David couldn't speak. He just nodded, the tears he had held back for a decade finally falling, not in grief, but in grace. His name was clear. His soul was free.
The grand opening of the Phoenix Community Plaza was a citywide celebration. The sterile architectural model had been transformed into a living, breathing space. Children laughed in the splash pad of the central amphitheater, the marketplace buzzed with the energy of local vendors, and the scent of flowers from the rooftop garden drifted on the breeze. It was more than a development, it was a home. David Chenault stood on the stage, not as a disgraced ghost, but as the celebrated architect who had given the neighborhood back its heart. Imani was beside him, her hand in his. Samuel Kingston stood with them, not as a CEO, but as a proud partner. He announced that Kingston Properties was launching a new charitable arm, the Chenault Foundation, dedicated to funding ethical urban design and supporting communities in need. David would be its director. His name, once a synonym for tragedy, was now a symbol of hope and redemption. Later that evening, after the crowds had thinned, David, Imani, and Samuel stood on the balcony of the new Community Arts Center, looking out over the plaza they had built together. The lights twinkled, and the sound of a local jazz trio drifted up from the amphitheater. "It's beautiful," Imani said, leaning her head on David's shoulder. "We built it," David said, a quiet sense of wonder in his voice. "No," Samuel corrected gently, placing a hand on both their shoulders. "You did. You reminded me that a legacy isn't built with steel and glass. It's built with empathy. It's built with soul." As they stood there, David saw a young man sitting on a bench below, sketching in a worn notebook, his face filled with a familiar, lonely intensity. He looked like a younger version of himself, a ghost in the making. Without a word, David left the balcony and walked down into the plaza. He approached the young man, who looked up, startled. "That's a good start, but the sightlines are a little off. Let me show you." He sat down on the bench, not as a celebrated architect, but as a man who understood. He took the young man's pencil and began to draw, passing on the gift that had been given back to him. He was no longer just building structures. He was building architects. He was building the future.
If this story of David and Samuel reminded you that a person's worth is not defined by their circumstances, and that even the deepest wounds can be healed with truth and compassion, then we invite you to be part of our community. We share stories of quiet courage, of redemption against all odds, and of the power of one person to rebuild not just a city, but a soul. If it meant something to you, share it with someone who believes that a true legacy is built with heart. Leave a comment. What does a community with a soul look like to you? Subscribe for more tales where ghosts of the past are finally laid to rest and the future is built on hope. No pressure, just real stories that prove everyone deserves a second chance to build something beautiful.